give us perspectives from continental scholarship on the chronological changes that we see in the English sequence as a result of the work that was presented this morning. And I'm very pleased indeed to introduce our first speaker this afternoon, Dr. Andreas Rau, from the Zentrum für Baltische und Skandinavische Archaeologie at Schlosskloster, Schleswig. An eminent scholar whose recent works include the seminal, really, analysis of the more recent finds in the Nudan hoard, who's going to talk to us on a view from northern Germany and Scandinavia, and particularly with an emphasis on the earlier part of the period and the way in which current ideas about chronology in North Germany and South Scandinavia mesh with the results that we've seen from Spong Hill. So, Andreas.
Thank you very much indeed. I must admit from the beginning that I was more than happy to read Frank Siegmund's abstract that he would mainly focus on the 6th and 7th centuries, which allows me to comment primarily on the 5th and early 6th century, and it's of course in 25 minutes impossible to cover more than some general remarks and 3 case studies and how they relate to the new Spong Hill chronology. And I also have to admit that I leave out most of the Scandinavian chronological discussion, but thanks to unpublished and brand new radiocarbon datings of the traditional border between Scandinavia and the continent, the Dennevik Rampart, which is now dated to the 4th and 5th century AD, this makes Södra Bravo actually be a Scandinavian site. It doesn't really spoil my title, so I'm quite pleased with this chronology. There are indeed a number of regional chronological studies for the 5th to 7th centuries for Denmark, Norway and Sweden published during the last 2 decades. It is unnecessary to name them all, especially because most of these schemes for different parts of Scandinavia deal with a more regional development of material culture and can very hardly directly be connected to the early Anglo-Saxon sphere. Unfortunately, a huge PhD thesis on the sequence of weapon types from the early Roman Iron Age to the early Vendel period in Norway and Sweden by Rasmus Iversen, except for 3 summarizing illustrations, 2 of which you are seeing now, remains unpublished. It is a pity, especially because Iversen in his work also included cruciform brooches and other dress accessories, for example clasps and buckles, which might be of interest for comparison with the Anglo-Saxon male faces A and B, and also with the new Spong Hill chronology. Another important study is Anne Nørgaard Jorgensen's book from 1999 on the changes in weaponry during the Vendel period. It has been repeatedly referred to in the Anglo-Saxon Graves publication, though, so that it is rather useless for me to repeat what John and Khan have already discussed there. In any case, I would like to underline Kahn's and John's words once more that the chronology of the migration period and the Vendel period in Scandinavia and also in northern Germany is basically a chronology in which the relative sequence of types and type assemblages, graves and hoards, are absolutely chronologically fixated by comparison with other continental schemes. And Anne Nørgaard's work is no exception here. The Central European chronologies are sometimes regarded by Scandinavian scholars to be as more accurate in the calendar dates, but it is often ignored that the Central European sequences themselves are basically floating around some rather insecure absolute chronological landmarks. One project on the rim of the region in my focus, a project at the University of Uppsala, has tried to tackle the problem of an independent absolute chronology of the artifact sequence of the 5th to 6th century in central Sweden, also by including a number of radiocarbon samples. But to what extent and in what way the measurements were processed and modeled remains unknown to me. Nevertheless, if we especially look at the 5th and early 6th century, not only British but also continental archaeologists have often tried to tie their results to markers in the written sources, often overlooking the problems that these sources and their reliability are controversially discussed by historians, and also neglecting that single historical events rarely have a direct impact on visible change in material culture. So in the 6th article on the absolute chronology of the Netherlands regarding the Roman and Merovingian period, which is thought actually to be based on C14 datings, Lanting and von der Plicht try to match their proposed phasings with historical events, and one reads summarizing sentences like the one on the slide. It's quite surprising, actually. The Adventus Saxonum, or better say, the dogma that it cannot have happened before the 440s, is a good starting point for my few comments on the Spronghill publication in the 5th and early 6th century chronology. I would like to start by looking at the Spronghill correspondence analysis of furnishing of female burials, which, as the form of the parabola shows, cannot be considered totally ideal. A closer look on the segregation table reveals that the difference between inhumations and cremations have in some extent determined the sorting. Phase C inhumations contain a number of brooches which, due to their state of preservation, can be typologically identified, as here marked in red, while cremations have led to the survival of bone artifacts, here marked in blue, on the right side of the table. Additionally, Phase B has only 4 diagnostic types that are included in the seriation, which are plain bone rings, 2 subtypes of combs, one of which occurs only twice in the used data set, and miniature tweezers only, which also is occurring in just 2 graves. It may be suggested to regard the brooch types to be of more diagnostic value for Spronghill and other early finds in eastern Britain, and to slightly change the dividing lines between phases B and C. This would mean to accept that some inhumations have to be included in phase B, especially those inhumations which Bruckmann and Penn already in 2007 assigned to their female A1 phase. This way, there would be 7 diagnostic items for the B phase, and among them the large group of cruciform brooches type 2. But despite my little nagging, the sequence of the 4 groups of cruciform brooches, the small long brooches and other types, is really convincing, and especially the phase C with its many objects and combinations seems to be quite solid. So here you have the sequence of the cruciform brooches and small long brooches. Types of brooches have always played a specific role in the discussion of connections between early Anglo-Saxon Britain and northwestern Germany and Jutland. Unfortunately, there was often more disagreement than agreement in the chronology of most types. As just one example, I've chosen 3 more recent publications which have dealt with one of the most prominent common Saxon and early Anglo-Saxon brooch type, the chip-carved eagle arm brooches. There's not only the striking discrepancies between the relative sequence of all subtypes of chip-carved eagle arm brooches, but also in the calendrical date ranges. It has to be mentioned that Bruns and Imke both made use and rely on Horst Wolfgang Böhme's 1974 chronology. This chronology on the graves between the rivers Loire and Elbe is still widely used, but it is not unproblematic because Böhme himself has in quite a large series of shorter articles in several languages refined and sometimes even contradicted his earlier results in producing a chronological scheme. Probably not known to everybody is Böhme's own revision of his chronology, especially for Northern Gaul from 1987, which he has published in an article of 3 pages and 2 illustrations, and with no further methodological explanations. John Hines and Martin Welch have already in the 90s underlined the importance of this revision, also for the earliest Anglo-Saxon phases, but it has not been noted by everyone, and employing the old chronological scheme from 74 has often brought more confusion than clarity. Heike Pöbelmann has in her publication of the Jülich Cemetery at the Lower Rhine proven Böhme's division from 87 quite useful and stable, and she has, with special focus on the graves from the Rhineland and Gaul provinces that contain coins, suggested an absolute chronology for these groups. And I have myself, in an attempt to link the Danish migration period chronology with northern Germany, also employed the find groups A and B, and have come to the same absolute chronological dates as Pöbelmann. But how does this affect the northern German chronology, and how will this compare to the new Spronghill phasing? I would like to start with presenting you a combination diagram including 72 inhumations and cremations that contain at least 2 different types out of 20 brooch types from the 4th to the early 6th century between the rivers Ems and Elbe. The diagram consists of 4 large groups and fits very well with the assumed typological development of armbrustfibel, cruciform brooches, supporting arm brooches, equal arm brooches, and also some certain types of applied disc brooches. The second group contains those brooches which in northern Gaul are strongly connected with fine group A according to Böhme, while the third group contains those types which are indicative for Böhme's fine group B. The start of group 3 is equivalent to the occurrence of the first real cruciform brooches with head plates of borders groups 1 and 2, which broadly equals Toby Martin's types 1.1.2, 1.2.1, and 1.2.2. Toby, you might reconsider your nomenclature there. As well as with supporting arm brooches of the Markov-Perlberg type. The fourth and the last combination group on the lower right corner is small because of a strong decline in furnishing right, an obvious demographic downfall, and a change in female costume. This group comprises graves with a variety of bow brooches, some small long brooches, or small specimen with rectangular head plates. Imported fibula from Thuringia or the Rhineland indicate that this last small group starts sometime between 460 and 480. If we now look at the brooches which also occur in Spong Hill, it's the yellow columns, we find, except for the assumed but anyhow insecure and due to its cast manufacturing peculiar Tutelus brooch in grave 2506, no evidence for brooches that are either directly comprehended as diagnostic for fine group A or those connected with this specific horizon in female burials from northern Germany. This does not only hold true for Spong Hill, but also for the earliest Anglo-Saxon brooch types known from eastern England in general. For example, Nudam brooches or Nudam fibula, easily recognizable non-cast fibula made from copper alloy, occur very often in Schleswig-Holstein and in the neighboring areas of the lower Weser-Elbe triangle and the Jutland Peninsula. Although worn by both sexes, not a single specimen has up to now been identified in Britain. However, cast fibula of this type, in Britain better known as the Dorchester type brooch, shows in the distribution on the continent their close connection to the Nudam fibula, although they are in a few graves found in combination with earliest real cruciform brooches, which indicates their slightly later position. The Dorchester type brooches have been included by Toby Martin in his extensive noob study as his earliest cruciform brooch type 1.1.1. But his suggestion for the starting date of the Dorchester type, or this entire group 1.1, at about 450 is therefore certainly 30 years too late. The same point can be made for the distribution of the Perlberg-Mahndorf supporting arm brooches, which I considered as diagnostic for the third group of brooch combination in northwestern Germany. If we look at a recent distribution map of this type on the right side, supporting arm brooches of the Mahndorf-Perlberg group are now very frequent due to the mass of recorded single finds in Britain. Just for comparison, Böhme made a map in 74 which only had 4 dots in Britain, and now there's about, I think, 60 specimens listed. If we accept that these brooches are indeed a typological amalgamation of earlier supporting arm brooch types, which are chronologically closely linked with the earlier horizon of Böhme's fine groups A, their total absence in early Anglo-Saxon contexts has to be regarded as chronological. On the left map, you see the distribution of the Rossum type, and I've searched the PAS in vain, and with the probable exception of one find from Winchester in a supposed late Roman context, I could not find a single typical specimen from Britain. To conclude and cut it short, from a continental perspective, based on the brooches only, I rather see Spong Hill and other earliest Anglo-Saxon activities in eastern England starting not at 400, but rather in the 420s. If we try to counter-check these results from Spong Hill with the Issendorf inhumation cemetery, we will see some good matching there. Unfortunately, the Issendorf cemetery is still published only as a catalogue, so one has to extract the information from the catalogue only. Here you see once more the map to see what I'm going to talk about. The different colors on the Issendorf inhumation cemetery mark those graves which, on the basis of brooches, beads and belt types, could be attributed to a certain phase. It's quite clear that the cemetery was taking its start with a large male chamber on the north side of a Neolithic grave. The chamber grave was probably under a barrow, as you can see, because of the distance to the subsequent graves. And we can clearly correlate the four phases with the combination diagram that we've seen before and other chronological systems from the Rhineland, from southern Germany and Thuringia. The red graves, the group 1, includes Nudam brooches, late tutelus brooches, belt buckles and fittings typical for Böhme's find group A. The blue graves, group 2, contain cruciform brooches of borders groups 1 and 2. I'm not repeating Toby Martin's groups now. Applied saucer brooches of the types Liebenau and Krefeld-Gelleb, supporting arm brooches, military belts of Böhme's find group B, and equal arm brooches. Once again, this is actually those types that are the earliest types to be identified in Spong Hill. The green zone contains basically bow brooches with semicircular head plates, but also 5 graves with small long brooches. There are no finds of items typical of Böhme's group B and no indications for a connection with the late Roman military sphere. There's one interesting observation for this phase, a clear change of use of brooches in the female costume. During the occupation of the green zone, women obviously changed their clothing with brooches on the shoulders and on the breast. These graves are now marked with an S for shoulder to costumes where brooches were positioned on the breast and on the waist. And please note that the 4 or 5 graves with the small long brooches in positions at the waist are situated in the southern end of the zone. So if we attempt a mere interpolated division of this green zone further into a zone with earlier brooches in shoulder positions and the graves with brooches at the waist, we may assume that small long brooches and those with small rectangular head plates in Isendorf occur around AD 480 and until the early 6th century, which would match quite well with the suggestion for phase C of female associated graves in Spong Hill. The last yellow zone basically consists of imported brooch types, it's not here, or simple local copies of those Frankish or Thuringian brooches, and a rather uncommon gold bracelet. There's no closer connection with early Anglo-Saxon dress accessories in this latest zone of Isendorf anymore. The Isendorf inhumation cemetery matches quite perfectly actually the Spong Hill chronology, with zone 2 correlating to Spong Hill A and A/B and zone B with parts of Spong Hill B, while the later part of zone 3 and zone 4 seem to cover the same period as Spong Hill C. I have been talking about the brooches, now neglecting very many other furnishings, of course, and of course the most important burial items, the pottery vessels. So what about the pots in Spong Hill? Is the typological division useful for Spong Hill and Eastern England only, or do shapes and motifs of decoration also mirror some common trends with the continent? First of all, I tried to follow the detailed correspondence analysis of the pottery decoration, and I must admit that it was really hard to just understand this divisions between A1, A2, B, and C, and these small subdivisions. So for comparison with the continental pottery, I made a rather broad subdivision, because I also thought that if this cemetery is some sort of communal burial ground, I would have expected the occurrence of several styles and motifs to be based more on individual pottery tradition and not so much on chronological development. So I was forced to divide the decoration in 3 phases. One phase which is loosely connected with the others and which equals the former A1 subphase. And the second phase would represent the dense bulk of decoration variables in the middle, and phase C with which remains unaltered. To check if there are some comparable tendencies in the use of decoration types and combinations, I hastily checked the pottery from the Isendorf inhumations, which with a very broad division. To my own surprise, and especially surprising because it's a comparison between cremation urns and pottery in inhumations, we can see that as a tendency, this division of decoration styles also fits quite well with Isendorf. The zone 2 has vessels with traits of Spong Hill A and AB vessels, Zone 3 has vessels best paralleled by pots from phases B and also some phases C. And the last zone in Düsseldorf has similarities in phase C decorations and shapes and Spong Hill. If we now, for the end of the lecture, travel a little north beyond the Elbe to Süderbrarup, you remember, to Scandinavia, to a cemetery which has often been mentioned in connection with Spong Hill because of the similarities between the vessels. Especially the pottery analysis of Spong Hill plays an important role in the discussion of the latest cemetery phase in Süderbrarup, and furthermore for the question when the cemeteries in the entire region of Angeln are actually abundant. As shown here, there are quite different opinions on the end of these cemeteries, mainly because the study on the occurrence of decoration types in combination with the pot shapes was indeed lacking. I have concentrated on some characteristic decoration combinations that occur in Spong Hill and in Süderbrarup. Vertical bosses in combinations with groups of masked lines or grooves with a slashed horizontal cordon above. I've highlighted it here, but you can clearly see the similarities. These motifs occur either singly or in combination with each other in the phases A and B pottery at Spong Hill. Unfortunately, after the time of the Nydam fibula around 400 AD, it's the green symbols on the cemetery. Maybe I should mention that the cemetery, the northern cemetery in Süderbrarup, starts at this burial mound from the Bronze Age, and then there's mostly cremation graves here from the 4th century, then it's late 4th century, early 5th century, and then we have a zone here where there's actually no furnishing except a few combs and a few miniature trees. There's almost no furnishings in the graves, so that it was really hard to find out how long this last zone was actually used in absolute chronological terms. So, as I said, the furnishing might almost completely stop. So the chronological estimate on the end of Süderbrarup had to be based on the pottery only. And so, for a comparison, I've mapped the urns with almost direct or rather general parallels in Spong Hill phases A and B, and they indeed fill out the entire zone of non-furnished cremations. This has to mean that occupation in Süderbrarup, and most likely all other cemeteries in Angeln, did not go beyond the 3rd quarter of the 5th century, and that the end of Süderbrarup is 1 or 2 generations later than the start of Spong Hill. To sum up, I think that a state of research has now been reached in which the chronological frameworks employed for Britain and the continent for some group of material cultures allow a discussion not of thirds or halves of centuries, but sometimes only of 1 or 2 decades. I hold the upper sentence on my last slide to be utterly important because in the past it has been very easy to accept differences in the chronology of especially 5th century artifact types in Britain and on the continent as mirroring reality and explain those differences by heavily deviating currencies. The new Spong Hill chronology, with the huge number of burials from the start of the cemetery, will have severe consequences on the discussion of the quantities and mechanisms for group migration to post-Roman Britain. But with a solid 5th century chronology at hand, we will now be able to focus not only on people and material culture coming and evolving in Britain, we will now be able to understand also people and artifacts that come from Britain to the continent during the 5th to 7th century much better. And my last sentence is, once continental and Scandinavian researchers will have recovered from, I'd say, the paralyzing impact that these new publications have made, I'm quite sure the books will be considered milestones in migration and Merovingian period research in entire Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andreas, for such a lucid and focused overview. Can I invite questions from Andreas?
Comment rather than a question, which is that, as I've already said.
Oh, I'm here.
Does it sound lucid?
I talk loud here.
How do you do? The sound can't hear you very well.
Okay. Can you go back to your one with the colours on it, the correspondence analysis?
The pottery, or you mean?
No, the big objects.
The objects. Was it right? It was right.
That one.
This one.
So I think you're absolutely absolutely right, and I'm more than happy for things to shift around between boundaries. And I've already said that the correspondence analysis on the grave goods was really problematic, and you end up getting down to really quite a limited number of burials with enough combinations of types to be able to. And that took me weeks and weeks and weeks, and was as good as I could get it. I think there is a really interesting shift, and you're concentrating there on the brooch types. And I think brooch use comes in relatively late. And so I think there is a difference between the early phase burials that use predominantly the iron miniatures and worked bone artefacts, and then a later phase that uses the brooches. And I'm more than happy for some of the phase C ones to come back into phase B. When only if you read the volume, you will see that there are quite a large number of burials that are phase B/C and A/B because of the difficulties in resolving those. But I think, broadly, we're hugely encouraged that our schemes agree with your schemes. And I think the overall picture is
it fits quite well.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
Catherine, and then Liz.
It's also by way of a comment, and I'm a bit relieved to discover that we're not too much in disagreement, although I'm not surprised since I thought I was actually absorbing what you told me. But I was interested in your last bit about the latest phase of Sumabara without grave goods, because that sort of happens with us. I mean, our later, phase C is including quite a lot of sites that have very few diagnostic grave goods. So I think there is this issue of the cremation burial ritual, having a phase where it's very coherent in detail and has miniatures and stamping pots, who are the family groupings that we were talking about, which you can certainly see. And then there's a phase when it becomes less and less meaningful, which I think is the tail off, and they stop putting things in. But I have a question that was obviously very interesting.
While we're collecting points for future research, I do think that the cremation burial rite, and in particular chronology cremation burial rite through late 6th, late 15th, 6th century, is something that now needs serious looking at and serious revision. Alex, you have a question?
Yes, this is a real question. This is an innocent question as an outsider. Okay, so you have your continental scheme that you think, you say 420 to 30 to 460 fits with your correspondence analysis from Hill. I have been, as an outsider, is that 6 coins or 6 TPQs? Have you got any dendro dates? Have you got any hordes? How many dates is your quite tight phasing based on?
Well, I can't give you the exact number of dates, of course, but it's basically coins, and there's a few dendro dates. There's, especially for this fine group A and B, there's more dendro dates coming now. It's quite a pity that there's this well-known cemetery at the Falbart, which is very good preservation of wood, that has produced some relevant dendro dates, but they are not published. They're just circulating around, and people get to hear some different dates on different burials. I had the chance to go to the guy who made the dendrochronological analysis, and he showed me the sheets, so I just copied it in my mind and then wrote it down. So I'm actually one of the only person who knows the dendro dates. So this is excuse me.
It's hardly peer-reviewed dendro.
Right, exactly. So this is the things we have to rely on. I'm quite positive that the coins work quite well. I left this bit out here. I wanted to show, for example, the cemetery in Fron in France, where you have small coinage in the graves during the entire occupation of the cemetery. You can clearly see the shift of the coinage correlating to the shifts of material culture, so that you get an idea that these fine groups A and B are actually quite precisely determined right now. So I wouldn't think there's too much discussion anymore about these statements.
I think I would add to that regardless of the chronological fixed points, the relative sequence matches very well with the relative sequence of the storm, which is a separate issue, but that leads to confidence that there's a robust relative sequence emerging. Any further points or questions on what we've heard from Andreas?